Glenn's actually a UQ alumni, but he's been working for the last 20 odd years, I believe, with Food Standards Australia and New Zealand, which is, as a lot of people know, one of the major regulatory bodies associated with the food regulations in Australia and in New Zealand. Probably one of the few collaborations.
Yeah.
It's an interesting organisation in that way. So Glenn did a PhD in neurophysiology in the Department of Medicine at UQ and also holds qualifications in diagnostic radiology and ultrasound. And I'm really interested to see how you've come from that background to be working in food safety.
I'll tell you about that.
We often tell the students that it doesn't matter where you start from, but where the links you form and the bigger networks you make over there, both in your PhDs and afterwards, that really start your career. So you've obviously had an interesting career trajectory.
That's right.
So we'll let talk.
Yep. Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for the invitation to say a few words here today. And it came at a good time, actually, because we've recently become the risk management and intelligence branch, and my boss must have said too much at the board and about intelligence, and FSANZ getting into that space, so he said, well, you can call yourself the intelligence branch now as well. How did I suppose get from neurophysiology? Well, after I suppose a postdoc, I went to work in Canberra at the where we were doing toxicology of ag and vet chemicals. Okay, at that time, a lot of the staff that went from that section to the newly formed National Food Authority. Who's heard of the NFA here? Yes, Professor Gidley over there. That's good. Well, that started in about the 1991 era, and that's when a lot of the staff were going from toxicology into that, because it offered a little bit broader expertise than doing great reviews of toxicology all day and that. It's a great time. I joined it in about 1995, I think it was, and it was right at the time when we became ANSFA, Australian New Zealand Food Authority. Who's heard of that one? Two more hands, three, that's good. Well, that was a great idea where the ministers got together and thought, can we have food standards across two countries? Unbelievable. And did it create work? Absolutely. For 4 or 5 years, we just concentrated on merging standards across the countries, and also still getting on with the daily work, of doing what we call applications and proposals, and I'll explain them as we go through a bit. So we had to do all that kind of work, plus the review work. And then after all that, we became Food Standards Australia and New Zealand, and probably everyone's heard of FSANZ. So there's a little bit of history there. I'm not doing a marketing job, but it is a really, really fascinating place to work. You get, for a scientist, you just have to, I suppose, move out of your research mind and thinking and broaden a little bit into regulatory thinking, capturing what the environment is, considering your stakeholders. Consumers are really very, very important stakeholders. All right, so what am I going to talk about today? Also, just before I want to start that, the NFA was set up with the intent to have uniform standards of foods setting across Australia at that time. Obviously, we've got it across two countries now, but in previous to that, you had the food industry had produced food, for instance, in the Queensland type of food acts or the food standards. And then if you wanted to go to WA, you had maybe a different standard for a certain commodity, some another state another one. So the ministers thought this is inefficient. So that's why we were created, to get that uniform agreement across Australia and New Zealand now. Okay, so what I want to talk about today, well, I've already given a bit of a quick review of the system, but I'll talk a little bit more about it in a minute. Importantly, talk about some of the ministerial priorities, and that's really setting the scene for us going forward in the next few years. Talking about issues and trust in science, like we're under closer scrutiny all the time now within the regulatory environment, and so it's very important that we stand behind our science, have good science, and that people trust that science. Talk about how we go about risk analysis, and a part of that talk that I was going to give at the Trop Ag Fest was about emerging and ongoing issues, and I've had a lot to do with that in the last 4 or 5 years, because that's really where you can get ahead of the game if you've got the right intelligence. You can also show how much trust there is in the science out there, and whether people trust your agency in handling those issues. So that's an important area. I've got some case examples just spread across. Mainly, my background's more towards contaminants in the food supply, so I've got a bit of a bent there, but I've got a couple of ones that should also interest broader aspects in this audience. Some take-home messages, and then, of course, open it up for questions. I meant to say also, hello to whoever's out there on the line too. We're a part of Australia, so welcome. Just a little bit about who we are. We're a statutory authority within the Australian Government Health Portfolio. We were established under the FSANZ Act as an Act of Parliament. We outnumber the New Zealand's 5-1 there. It doesn't mean they don't punch above their weight though. I'm putting in a good word for my boss here, of course. Our main function is to administer and develop the Australia-New Zealand Food Standards Code. We're not responsible for enforcement, but having said that, we do work very closely with our jurisdictions, and the very important part is how close we work, and that's what makes the system so successful. Our objectives are threefold. Firstly, to ensure that public health and safety is one of our main priorities at FSANZ. That adequate information is available to consumers so they can make an informed choice about the food purchases they have. Also, that the industry doesn't have any misleading and deceptive conduct, so that's part of our act as well. Underneath that, we also have other requirements that our risk analysis is based on the best available science. We try and look at where we can, domestically, can we have consistency between our domestic and international standards, and we're thinking here of Codex. When we did I was talking about those 4 or 5 intense years reviewing the code, we were always looking for opportunities about could we capture a Codex standard and do a risk assessment, and would that risk assessment support the Codex standard in the food code? And we've got a number of examples of that in the contaminant standard at the moment. The maximum levels for lead in the code were based originally on the Codex standards and still are, and Codex is still reviewing those as well. So there's also, part of that is also keeping up to date with that when standards change. We also want to encourage an efficient and internationally competitive food industry, and that's where you, in the audience, you come in very much for the research you're doing. Encouraging fair trade in food, and the last one is policy guidance by the Ministerial Forum. They often give us policy parameters that we have to take into account in our own work. Oh, right, that's my only black letter of the law slide. It's a dad joke, isn't it? But we've changed the format there at FSANZ, that's supposed to be the black background. But just to give you a snapshot of those of you that haven't seen the Australian-New Zealand Food Standards Code, there's various chapters. The first one, Chapter 1, gives you all the common general requirements for all foods, such as labelling, substances added to food, such as food additives that you see there, the contaminants standard, maximum residue levels and that. Into Chapter 2, you get more of the food commodity type standards, where you see some of the commodity standards as cereals. There's one for honey, there's one for sugar, there's fruits and vegetables and that. Chapter 3 is more into the hygiene type requirements of food, and what types of food safety programs businesses must have to make sure that they produce safe food. And the 4th chapter is the primary production standards, where we're trying to take a paddock to plate approach, and if you have a good quality control system from the paddock to plate, you have a better chance of producing good, safe and nutritious food. Lastly, there's lots of schedules now which lists out all the types of maximum limits that might be available, for instance in contaminants, or maximum residue limits in ag and vet chemicals, and other vitamins and minerals types of schedules and things. So they're in a new format there. So as I said, I've worked quite a lot in the contaminants area, which is Schedule 2 of the code. Right, very important, there's 3 priorities the ministers have given us going forward. The first one is to reduce foodborne disease, and obviously that's a very important one. We know that there's lots of work going on in Campylobacter and Salmonella, and Queensland Health, for instance, and the other states and territories are involved in all those types of surveillance of the food supply. We see what just happens recently with Listeria, didn't we, in the melons. It just shows you what can go wrong, and certainly how do you fix that, and how do you prevent it happening again is, you know, a pretty big question, an important question. Priority 2 is to support public health objectives, and that's really quite a broad one for FSANZ, and I know Mike Gillies over there nodding because he would probably have heard the board our FSANZ board grapple with what is FSANZ's role in public health, right? And you could do a cross-section across the agency, and I might say, well, it's to reduce contamination from my perspective, but if you've got a nutritionist, you know, it's obviously we want to try and alleviate obesity or prevent the obesity crisis that's happening. So it's something we must consider in our work as we're going forward. And I suppose the most topical one at the moment is looking at the sugar labelling and the added sugar labelling on labels. And there's certainly a lot of work going on about that. Priority 3 is where our particular branch and section is very active, maintaining a strong, robust and agile food regulatory system. For those of you that you might have heard that if the food industry has a specific standard or wants to change a particular standard in the code, they can make an application to FSANZ, and we've got a format for that. And an example might be increasing permissions for food irradiation in the code. There's been a lot of requests recently for phytosanitary approvals to alleviate Queensland fruit fly, and we've got a number of approvals in the code. There's a very exciting application coming through, and I'll tell you about that in other questions if you like. The other alternative work we do are proposals where we might identify a public health and safety issue and wish to do something about that. And I've got a case example of that in one of the examples coming up later. Our other projects are W projects, and this is where we might decide to do a bit of research before we even do anything, which is, you know, obviously sometimes a good idea, get an evidence base. Do we need to change the code or don't we? Think of other options in that. And so that's all captured under having this strong, robust and agile food regulatory system. Being able to move with the times, really. So some of the key issues, we know now that there's increasingly globalisation of the food supply chain. We eat a different variety of food in our diets daily. Our industry export to different countries. They have different standards to export. There's more pressure on reduced regulation and recognition of international standards. I already said that a little bit earlier. So we really are in the space, FSANZ in the space of minimal effective regulation, right? That gets us a little bit, I suppose, in the public eye there at times too, because some stakeholders, some of the consumer stakeholders might think that we should do more than have minimal effective regulation. So there's a lot of debate going forward about that. The growing pace of technological change also is something that we must think of. We now know that they're using the blockchain platform for looking at surveillance and I was trying to think of the system checks that you have from when you produce the food through to where you sell the food. And so that blockchain technology is they're looking at possibly whether that's a new way of looking at the security of that food supply. The rapid proliferation of real-time information about food. You know, it's quite common when these emerging issues arise, you'll get a reporter ring FSANZ and say there's a new paper out about this particular subject. It's been out for 2 hours, what's your view? And you go, well, any chance we could read it? But yeah, like you've got to, I mean, obviously we've got to be able to accommodate those things so that we get the factually correct evidence out there for consumers. But that doesn't also mean that we're going to call something safe if we're not sure of it as well. There's a growing concern about diet-related contributions to increased prevalence of lifestyle diseases as well. and we all operate under a fiscal constraint on government agencies. There's less resources and always quite a lot to do. You've probably seen, some of you have probably seen this. FSANZ operates under the Codex risk analysis framework. So we have 3 components, which is risk assessment, management and communication. Basically, for about probably 13 years at FSANZ, we've had a functional separation of the risk assessment branch from the risk management branch. And although there is a functional separation, it doesn't mean we don't talk to each other. We do work really collaboratively, and but the risk managers are charged with setting the risk assessment questions. They're negotiated, of course, but it's a good way of separating the science necessary from the policy. And of course, we work within project teams and have that constant interaction. Risk communication, very important part of that circle, and the other part, of course, is having evidence and also surveillance and monitoring of the food supply to give you that evidence to whether you need to do a risk assessment or not, and then consider the risk management options that might result. So I did toxicology for quite a while at FSANZ. I was in the risk assessment section for about 5 or 6 years before this restructure that came, and I ended up in the risk management area. And it's actually an interesting, it was a change, but it was a very good change for me, and I found it quite broadening and quite a lot more, I suppose, interesting than doing the pure risk assessment all the time. So some of the principles, though, we use for managing risks are those above. We're really aiming to protect the population at large. You will get, it doesn't mean we don't look at susceptible groups, and certainly infants or pregnant females or other, the elderly population, whether you want to call them at risk, but we certainly aim to protect the population at large, but we do look at the other at-risk factors. We aim to have an evidence base, and we're a very open and transparent organisation. Everything we do, we publicly, we call for public comment on. For our normal standards work, that's about 6 weeks public consultation period, but we can extend that if it's a particular issue we want to investigate more and get more kind of consultation out there from people. We formulate a number of options to mitigate risk, and those, I'll run you through them at the next slide, but they can be non-regulatory or regulatory. We have a mandate to look at all options, really, and that includes doing nothing. So we always have an option out there. You'll see on our reports of status quo, okay? And but we will go through all those options. And in some of the work as well, we're required to do quite a detailed regulatory impact analysis, and we work very closely with what another agency called the Office of Best Practice Regulator in Canberra. They've got a lot of economists in that. We have economists at FSANZ as well, but we also, part of that standards is looking at the costs and benefits of any particular standard. We want our response to be proportionate to risk. High risk, we want to act quickly. We might want to use the black letter of the law a bit more. For a different type of risk, we might be able to manage that a different way. Also, as I said before, we're very keen when we're managing risk to meet any international and legislative obligations. So that little slide there just gives you a little bit of a range of some of the types of, I haven't got my pointer, but we can have regulatory or non-regulatory measures. So regulatory measures might be end product standards such as maximum limits in the code for contaminants or agricultural and veterinary chemicals. We might have non-regulatory measures such as codes of practice or guidelines. And a nice example is the mercury in fish consumer awareness brochure. Has anyone seen that? Well, number one is we do have maximum limits in the code for mercury in seafood, right? But we also have website consumer advice that you pregnant women can only eat certain species of fish up to a maximum amount per week. And that you might call that a non-regulatory measure. And that's been quite useful because those brochures went out to the GPs and that around the country, and we're getting good feedback that it's a great way of managing that particular risk to keep mercury exposure down during key times. Yeah. The outcome-based standards are those Chapter 3 and 4 standards that I talked about. They don't actually necessarily tell you the process to get to that standard, but they have an idea, I suppose, a bit like what are you aiming for, and letting the industry aim for that and putting in their own quality control checks to get there. So that's what we mean by outcome-based standards. A lot of our work also around end product standards involve pre-market assessment, and I mentioned genetically modified foods. We do pre-market assessments. We do pre-market assessments on food additives, food irradiation, all that. So we can do also a hybrid risk management approach as well. We can combine the regulatory and non-regulatory. So all that is looked at when we're going through our process. I think I've already said that we have the best available evidence, and we take into account a number of other factors. And those other factors, for instance, is probably why we actually label irradiated food, because that's been quite a debate for quite a while in the country. Why did FSANZ have labelling of irradiated foods? It was for consumer awareness, basically. It wasn't really a safety issue. And so part of your risk management also is capturing that, I suppose the learning from what our consultation was. What would be the most successful way to bring in a standard, and what would satisfy a lot of the stakeholders as well. And those stakeholders also include our ministers. So our ministers can also direct us to take a certain approach, or they can assist on sending a standard back for us to review with a view to, say, putting a different policy in place. So the policy for irradiated food is they are labelled, and they are labelled no matter how minor the ingredient as well, which is quite a rigorous labelling compared to other countries of food irradiation. And GM foods are labelled when there's a novel protein or DNA in the final food. There are some exceptions there. There's no real exceptions for the irradiated food component though. Right. Yeah, we also embrace, uncertainty as a fact of life in some of the science as well. And some of the when we're doing health-based guidance values, for instance, for food additives such as acceptable daily intakes, there'll be uncertainty factors that you put into the toxicology profile so that you arrive at a figure that might have 100-fold safety factor or 100-fold uncertainty factor between the highest level, which causes no effect in an animal study, versus what might be the final level you have as a health-based guidance value. So there are some conservatism in there, but it's in there for some good reasons at times too. The key is to characterise that risk, to articulate it, and to monitor it after you've got it in place. All right, so we'll get into some ongoing and emerging issues and some examples. About 4 or 5 years ago at FSANZ, our senior executive asked us to look at how do we identify new risks in the food supply? How do we identify new hazards? How do we tell whether there's been an increased exposure? When something happens overseas, how do we capture that? How do we get ahead of the game and find out before something's publicly announced what might be coming our way? So we set up, we worked on this for quite a while. We set up all the key portals that you might get information in from FSANZ about food safety types of risks. And a lot of those can be one-on-one interactions with your colleagues overseas. It can be from state and territory health departments. It can be from the European Food Safety Authority, the US FDA. There's a whole lot of screening of these sources, and so we looked at a better way to predict the risks, and we developed criterion for when we would escalate that risk. And so in essence, in the organisation, the senior science group we have acts as a kind of like a clearinghouse, so that if there's a new issue that comes in, we expect the person that's privy to that information, they fill in a particular template, they take that to the senior science group, and then we discuss whether that needs to go forward to executive quickly, whether we need to just get more information, whether we need to just sit on it and see what happens for a while. But we certainly got a good collaboration with our other international regulatory colleagues, so often we get embargoed copies of their assessments before that actually goes out into the public, which helps us do that. If you want to look at ongoing, if you search for ongoing issues on our website, you'll see an example of some of those issues that we did up to December 2017, and our views on what is happening in the future with them. All right, we'll just go through a few examples now just of that. A while, now it's probably 3 or 4 years ago now, that we became alerted that lupin might be a new allergen in the food supply. The use of lupin was becoming widespread, particularly in Western Australia, and so there were some reports, and we also had some medical officer intelligence that also indicated that that could be a new allergen. So we did a risk assessment, and we verified that we agreed that that could be a new allergen. So we also knew that within the European Union there was already a mandatory declaration required, so we also knew that they'd also managed it a certain way as well. When we did some of the economics, let's say we did working with the Office of Best Practice Regulator and got our economists involved, we found out these are estimates that there was 300,000 potential lupin allergen sufferers in Australia and New Zealand. So that resulted in the code a requirement to mandatory declare it as to label it as a mandatory allergen. That 12-month transitional period was put in there to allow the industry to meet those requirements. That was probably reasonably controversial for some stakeholders, because some of the medical stakeholders we're talking about that was giving us advice saying we should act a lot sooner. However, that's now in place, and so there is a requirement now to do that declaration. Did anyone know about that lupin in this room? Yeah. 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 We all like our acrylamide in the mornings, don't we? We all like our toast, our cereals and things, and the Swedish, I think it was 2002, as they got better at the chemists, there's probably plenty of chemists in the room here as well, as the chemists get better at detecting things, they get better at finding things, and of course acrylamide was found, and it's a contaminant that's caused by the heating of starches and the processes, it's known to, it's got some toxicology data that suggests that it causes cancer in animals, and certainly the Joint Expert Committee on Food Additives, which is an international contaminants and food additives setting risk assessment agency, think that it's a genotoxic carcinogen, so it's got no real safe level. So obviously, we're interested in that. At the time, our toxicologists don't always agree with things, and we've been really keeping a watching brief on international developments, and particularly by what's called the Codex Committee on Contaminants and Food, the CCCF. They produced a guideline to control acrylamide and keep its level as low as they could in the types of food, and one was cereals and the other one was in potatoes. We produced an acrylamide infographic for consumers, and there's been a little bit of the food industry have also played their part with revising some instructions on temperature control on potato chips as well to keep that reduction down. So our message is to still eat a balanced diet. You might say you may not want to burn your toast regularly and eat that regularly, but that's a very subjective type of consumer statement, isn't it? Ready to say that. So a balanced diet, knowing that we eat a variety of foods, is still what we think. And the US also have been promising that they're going to bring out some more studies, long-term studies on acrylamide as well in animals, which will help look at the whole risk assessment again. So that's really a non-regulatory approach we've taken there with that particular contaminant. Example 2 I was directly involved in was a proposal to look at cyanogenic glycosides in food. In particular, we were concentrating on apricot kernels, and it was actually Queensland Health had indicated to us that there was a number of acute poisoning instances in Queensland from people that were consuming apricot kernels. Some people would consume between 10 and 40 kernels per day with a view that it would alleviate cancer. But actually, yeah, interesting, yeah. And it was pretty sad, some of the submissions we got too, because you had some polarised views there, because some consumers would say, well, what's the government doing? You're taking away our right to do something about cancer, you know. The Cancer Council had a different view on that. And then you got also some submitters was quite sad, was that she had said her husband and uncle, believe it or not, in the same family, had believed the claims that these would alleviate their cancer and gone off their oncology drugs and recommendations. So they had passed away, unfortunately. So what we did, we raised a proposal and the FSANZ board agreed it was a significant public health and safety issue, and we ended up prohibiting them from the food supply. Now, the other side of things is apricot kernels can be also used safely in foods, provided that you render them safe, such as a heating process, or you mix them, you heat them, you mix them. They can be quite offset the sweetening flavour of you know, the bitterness of the kernel can offset the sweetness of some of the foods that you might be using them in. And I think those Lee Henderson used to talk about a liqueur, amaretti liqueur or something. But there was also some of they replace the almond, I think, sometimes too with apricot kernels as well. So provided that you render them safe before consumption, we still allow them to be sold in foods and that. So that's something we did in relation to a request from a jurisdiction. It was Queensland that was originally requested that for us to look at it. So that was probably the biggest stick item, you know, in terms of regulation that I've ever been involved in at FSANZ, in actually prohibiting something from the food supply. I'm not sure how you say those, we'll say PAs. But the Salvation Jane area, that obviously they're found in honey, tea, and the grains and other foods there. We've been looking at this for a number of years. Mary knows my previous boss, Lee Henderson, was right up there with that, trying to coordinate data from the honey industry, levels from the honey industry, from the Australian side and the New Zealand side. We've had a toxicologist in the New Zealand office, Rosalind, who has been looking at the acute toxic parts on the particular PAs that are acutely toxic. And the Joint Expert Committee on Food Additives are looking at it. So what we're doing is hanging back and seeing what they come up with as well. We're not acting as yet. And after that, we'll consider potential risk management options, and they could be regulatory or non-regulatory. We also know that it'll come back onto the Codex Committee on Contaminants in Food as well. So we're a bit kind of, I suppose, waiting to see which way this will go in terms of the risk assessment first before we actually jump to any risk management types of decisions. And as I said earlier, if there is something that comes out of the Codex Committee on Contaminants in Food, a level or a particular risk management option, that might be the one that we go for. It might be just wise to wait before we act, unless something changes that type of decision. The last example, some of you probably heard a lot of press over the years from Bisphenol A or phthalates in food, and FSANZ board about 4 or 5 years ago said, well, what are we actually doing in this space, and what are we going to do about are there chemicals that could potentially migrate from packaging to food? And yes, there's a number of them. What were the potential risks? What's currently in place to control that? Do we need better? Do we need improved? Do we need the same? Do we need nothing? And otherwise, was the regulation at this point in time adequate? So we raised a proposal. It was called P1034. It's on our website. It was quite a big proposal. We went out and spoke to a number of stakeholders, Australian and New Zealand industry, Australian and New Zealand consumers, Australian and New Zealand governments, all our partners in the states and territories and that. And what we came up with, talking of different ways to look at things, we knew that a lot of these chemicals, inherently they can be quite toxic, right? But if you're not exposed to them, well, that's a different thing, isn't it? So what we were looking at is getting as much evidence base from our surveillance team to see what types of levels might be in food, and then characterise the risk with the available toxicology data. And so we've got this this arrow, which is really the risk arrow pushing one way, and the other way is the control measures arrow, and you're arriving at what we call the residual risk. And some of those control measures might be applications of what's already in the code in those food safety provisions, in the actual state and territory food acts. We know that a lot of the industry has through chain suppliance programs in place. They've got codes of practice. We also know that the US and Europe have really quite strict packaging requirements. So in a way, because we're looking at multinational companies a lot of the time producing packaging, there are small businesses as well, I'll get to them in a minute, but it means that we've got a minimum benchmark in Australia and New Zealand, so we're quite lucky in a way that that's what's kept a lot of that migration from chemicals from plastics into food down to a level where we decided that we didn't need to particularly intervene. But just before that, we came up with a graduated approach, which also had like a low risk and a high risk arm. So if, for instance, that we had found that there had been significant exposure, we were concentrating on a couple of the phthalates in particular. In the end, we found that they were underneath the recognised health-based guidance values, so we really had no high-risk chemicals we thought that was left in the food supply. So we decided not to go down the setting maximum limit approach. Rather, we've gone down a non-regulatory approach of a packaging information guide, and that's still being delivered, still being worked on, and we'll bring that forward in due course. The other part was we could have thought of where we might be able to strengthen the food code and some of the provisions in the food safety area, chapter 3 areas if we needed. But once again, the risk assessment didn't support that. So that was an interesting one to be involved in. All right, just some final couple of slides, just some key messages. So you've heard that Australia and New Zealand, we've got a unique partnership between both our countries. It works really, really well, and a lot of our international colleagues sometimes jealous of the approach that we could merge two regulatory systems in one. We've got an open and transparent process. We have a consultation period with all of our standards work. We value submissions from stakeholders. We do listen. I've told you of some parts where we did listen, particularly with that Apricot Kernels proposal and that. We keep a watch on emerging hazards and risks, and we use key principles in some of our work. We use the Codex risk analysis process, and we use key principles in risk management. And we manage the uncertainties in science. So as a take-home message, our strategy going forward is to be a trusted source of advice on food, a leader in our own area of expertise, a source of wisdom on emerging risks, so that the media can come to us and other stakeholders knowing that whatever we say has some solid evidence base and facts behind it. We're deeply engaged with stakeholders, and we're trying to promote an agile, effective and efficient food regulatory system going forward. I've probably gone a bit on there, but thank you very much. I'm happy to take some questions.